Hi, I'm Gordon Burkell, and this is Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. Every week, we bring on a film professional to discuss their work, and this is made possible by our sponsors, OWC. Go to owcdigital.com for all your filmmaking needs. This week, I'm joined by Bill Bennett, who's worked on numerous commercials. He's done numerous aerial work as well as miniatures, and you've worked closely with ARRI in an advisory capacity. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Well, thank you. Happy to be here.
My first question is, I've always wanted to do miniature shooting, or shooting miniatures, I guess I should say. What are some techniques or ideas that you would recommend for young people wanting to shoot miniatures?
In terms of actually shooting practical miniatures. Well, the miniature work that I did was on a film called Bugsy. Mm-hmm. And when I say it was a miniature, it was actually gigantic. In the story, this person, Bugsy Siegel, is building a casino outside of Las Vegas in the desert, which was pretty radical for the time. That area is now the Las Vegas Strip. He was building the Flamingo Hotel. And so the script required an overhead aerial shot. He was quite wealthy, so he had an airplane. And the script asked for aerial shot of him arriving and looking out the window of the airplane down to the ground to see the casino under construction. So the prop department and the set department had built a gigantic model of the casino as it existed back then under construction, complete with a road and cars driving by, and the casino itself and the parking lot. And I would vaguely remember now, the casino building itself and the parking lot was maybe 10 feet wide by 8 feet front to back, and maybe a foot tall, something like that. So it was that size miniature. And then what the Grips and I had done was they had taken the actual door off of this antique airplane. I can't remember. I think it was a early beach aircraft. They had taken the door off of the aircraft and brought it to set to us for us to look through as a foreground object. And there was going to be a reverse angle that the first unit was going to shoot of him looking out that same window, looking down at what we were going to shoot. Mm-hmm. The things that are necessary is clearly you need to simulate or emulate what that would look like in the real world. What happens when it wasn't so much of a problem for us because the set was gigantic, but what happens if you, for budgetary reasons, are forced to shoot smaller scale objects is you need to have a lot of depth of field, because when you shoot a building sitting in a parking lot, the depth of field is damn near infinite. Mm-hmm. So you need to emulate that. So you need a lot of light. You need a small aperture to create a lot of depth of field. The other gotcha is water in miniature tends to look too viscous, tends to look like honey. People tend to shoot a higher frame rate to cause the water to appear to move more slowly, like it would in a full-size scene. That exacerbates the honey-like aspect of it as well. So if you're going to do like ships at sea or whatever, you got to see if you can get the model to be as big as possible, so that the water doesn't look viscous. Those are things to look out for. So for us, it was, we didn't have any water. It was the desert, and our model was rather large. I had to build a rig to hold the door out in front of the camera, and then attach all of that together on the pan tilt head, so that as we dollied by and I could gently tilt up and down, the door would move in synchronization with the camera to create the illusion that the point of view of the person looking, the door wouldn't move relative to them. It would move up and down and sync, yet the background would look like the airplane was gently rolling. And I jiggled the camera a slight bit too to create simulate the vibration you would have in an airplane of that era.
It's interesting that you talked about, creating that sort of movement with the specially built thing, because you also built I think it's called the Microforce zoom control.
Yes. The story is, when I first started in the business, I was very lucky to meet a gentleman named Ron Dexter, who's now an ASC cinematographer. He was a cameraman director, did a lot of commercials. And I was struggling, we're talking 40 years ago, to get into the business. And I met him. And at that point in time, the only job I could get was doing set carpentry. So his prop person asked me to build a prop box for them. And I did that. And then I got introduced through that person to Ron, and then ultimately got hired by him. And for 6 or 7 years, worked my way up through grip, key grip, then camera assistant, ultimately camera operator.
Mm-hmm.
That took about a 7-year period. His brother-in-law is Howard Preston. Howard Preston owns Presta Cinema, and they build all the wireless focus systems. But we started out needing an early, really good quality zoom control, because the one prior to that was made by a company called Cinema Products, and it was electromechanical and always out of adjustment, and your zooms would start with a bump and end with a bump. And I had found the little joystick that's below the coolie hat at an electronics trade show that I attended. And it is actually the trim tab actuator that sits at the top of the joystick of an F-16 fighter jet. Mm-hmm. So it's military hardware built to those sort of specifications. I grabbed the brochure for it and took it to Howard and say, hey, can you build a servo motor circuit to drive the J4 zoom motor, but get rid of the J4 zoom control? And he looked at it and says, oh yeah, sure, I can do that. So he designed the circuit. I built a prototype. We tested it on a job. It worked really well. Then we built 4 prototypes, which we gave to the people who were building a camera system called the Ultracam at the time. It went off and worked on a movie called Poltergeist, which ended up being a big hit. And then the rest of it was history. Howard started building them commercially, and they became sort of the standard of the industry. And now his focus systems, which he also builds in concert, are very much seen on sets around the world as well.
Mm-hmm. So you've worked in numerous commercials. Is there something that you've learned throughout all these years that you wish you had known when you started?
The industry definitely tends to pigeonhole you. Doesn't matter if you're doing, as in my case, I specialized in commercials, and then I ended up doing a car commercial for BMW with this director I started working for after I worked for Ron Dexter, a guy named Brett Thomas, who's a brilliant director. We ended up doing a BMW commercial, and it turned out really well. And then we got another one and another one. So it just kept expanding and expanding. And commercials for automobiles tend to be one of the higher budget sort of projects out there. If you're going to be doing commercials, it's either going to be that or beer, or maybe hair and fashion sort of hair and makeup sort of stuff, high budget things. So not a bad area to be pigeonholed into, but you need to carefully steer your career in terms of, once you become rather, well known enough to where you start getting more calls. Early on, you take whatever you can get, because you got to take what you can get. But then later, when the calls start rolling in, we were also doing a lot of tabletop spots. Now, tabletop might be, kitchen utensil or food or things like that, things that all take place on a small table, and you typically shoot it with a jib arm. It's all macro photography and that kind of stuff. I was really good at that because I'm kind of mechanically inclined, and I could build the little rigs for the camera and for the product to spin the product and move the camera. But I really didn't enjoy spending hours on set where the whole world was 3 by 3 feet.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed being outdoors in the real world. So I started not putting the tabletop spots on my reel, and started putting the car commercials and the dramatic commercials with people and action on my reel, and sort of steered my career away from the tabletop stuff. Now, I'm not to say that, there are some people who really specialize in tabletop and are really, really good at it, and I don't want to disparage them. It's just that I didn't enjoy it. So the lesson, I guess I'm trying to say, is steer your career by what you put on your reel. In other words, don't build a reel with things in it if you don't really enjoy doing that stuff.
Interesting. Now, when you're shooting a commercial, it can be a tight schedule. So how do you work with the director to come up with a look for each of the commercials? Because it also involves numerous ad agency people and company people. How do you work with so many people to create the look?
Well, on the way into the job, they've typically hired you because they like what you've already typically done, some previous commercial in my case. So we will typically in our pre-production discussions maybe look at that commercial or frame grabs from that commercial and ask them, what do you like about it? What might you like changed? And then evolve from there. Of course, as a cinematographer, we keep wanting to try and do new things. As far as car commercials are concerned, it really comes down to, if you're working outside, to the time of day and where you are. It all comes down to being in the right place at the right time. So a lot of it has to do with having a really phenomenally good location scout that understands your style and can go find locations wherever the agency is specified. Quite often they'll say, okay, we want this to appear in the desert, or we want this to appear to be in forest country, or we want this to appear in Kansas with rolling wheat fields. They'll specify that ahead of time. So you'll send your location scout out to find places that look like that. But then that person needs to know what is the best suitable roads. I mean, the roads need to be new, essentially, meaning no chuck holes, no filled in potholes, new pavement, newly painted lines. And then also typical beautiful terrain, like straight roads. Like I once got hired to do a car commercial in Florida. Well, Florida doesn't have any hills, so they build the roads as cheaply as possible. They're absolutely straight, which for a car commercial is insanely boring. You see the car drive on the straight road, and then you see it drive on another straight road. The most interesting shots of cars are them going around either S-turns or corners or something like that, where you see different aspects of the car as it travels past the camera or around the camera. So all those things get involved. And then when you're doing a show where there's going to be interior sets, you have to become really good friends and connected with the production designer and then ultimately the set designers, so that you integrate the style of the commercial into the set that gets built. And that involves places to have lighting come from within the set, etc. You have to become intimately involved, and hopefully you get brought into the project early enough to where you can have an influence on how that stuff is happening.
I have a friend who was, when I talked to him last, he was working on a car commercial, but he was the VFX artist, and they were sort of, I guess there was a shot that they couldn't do, and they were just recreating the car in post. So how much has VFX impacted you as a cinematographer in commercials?
Over the years, because I've been, shooting during this period where VFX, to make a realistic car wasn't possible, and then slowly became possible. I was working during that period, and I remember the very, very first time they needed to recreate a car. We were doing a whole line commercial for Dodge Chrysler, where they show virtually every car they make during the course of a 60-second commercial. And the idea was these cars were flying through this imaginary plane where the car would evolve or dissolve from one model car to the next model car. And then it would do it over and over again. The commercial was called Time. And the Dodge Viper that we shot on set on a gimbal doing motion control all around it had big white racing stripes on it. Then they realized, Dodge decided that between the time the commercial was shot and the time it was going to release, the Dodge Viper would not be delivered with racing stripes on it for whatever reason. So they needed to remove the racing stripes. So the visual effects people at first started trying to just literally remove the racing stripes. It didn't look good. So then they realized, well, we've got the 3D model of the car that we're using to transition from one car to another car as it goes through the wall. Why don't we just try to light the car model? And they were unsuccessful at doing that. So they called me, it never looked right. So they called me in to the visual effects people. I believe it was Boss Films at the time down in Marina del Rey. And I sat with the digital animation designer, and I said to him, he showed me what didn't look right. The shape of the car was perfect because it was based upon the real 3D model of the car, but the lighting didn't look right. And I said, can you show me in your virtual world where the lights are? And he says, oh, yeah. So he turned them on and then zoomed out so I could actually see them. And I said, oh my God, the lights are in the wrong place. So I had him move the lights to where they should be. And when I say lights, they were big, huge soft sources. And I had them move them to where we had them on set. Now, of course, he had no way of knowing that. I moved them to where he had them on set, and he pushed render. Now, at that time, it took 10 minutes or so to render one frame. Now it's instantaneous. You can see it live. But then, it took like 10, 15 minutes. We went and had coffee. We came back, and my God, it looked like what we had shot. So in their virtual world, they've designed it so that light behaves the way it does in our world. Now, there are advantages in their world in that you could never put a gigantic, our real world, you could never put a gigantic soft light in front of the camera and see through it. Well, because it would block the camera, but in their world, they can't. So they actually have advantages that you can put this gigantic soft light right in front of the camera and then illuminate what you're shooting and see through it. It becomes invisible. So they have certain advantages, but they've designed that world to behave like the real world because they want things to look real. So I was there right from the very, very beginning. That was, if not the first, the second actual CG car that was realistic. There was another car right around the same time that I remember was held in the hand of someone. I vaguely remember that. So right around that same time, there were two cars, the Dodge Viper and mine. And then I would advise other commercials that were shot in the complete CG world to how to light the cars. So the rules are the same. And I've actually went up to advise the people who were doing the third iteration of the animated movie Cars to how to light cars with hard light, because in the Cars 1 and 2, if you look at the movie, the cars are lit, the cars have a matte surface. Now, when a CG object has a matte surface, it's relatively easy to light because you don't see the reflection of the light, right? So I went up there and did a seminar for them, showing them how I light cars in the real world. And then when they did Cars 3, the cars were shiny, and they knew where to place the lights so that they looked real and didn't look objectionable. That's probably the best way to say it. In other words, they learned how to light the cars beautifully. And that's not trivial when the cars are reflected or reflective surfaces.
Is there a commercial in your career that you're like, that's my favorite commercial I've gotten to work on, or one that you just, really enjoyed the process?
There are several. One of them was a Super Bowl commercial called New Kid, and we're talking 30 years ago now. There was a commercial, live action commercial, didn't have anything to do with cars. And the story was this older gentleman was working at McDonald's, and it was his first day. And the movie, the commercial, it's a whole 1 minute long complete story arc. He starts off at home. His older wife elderly wife is wishing him goodbye. He leaves the house. He walks to work. He passes a couple friends. They say, "You going fishing?" He says, "No, I'm going to work." Meanwhile, parallel to this, going on inside the McDonald's are some younger women, 20-something, or maybe even teens, who are chittering about how there's a new kid coming to work and they hope that he's cute. They're assuming that it's someone their age that they might become romantically involved with. It's their little private fantasy. And so that's happening parallel. And then he shows up at the door and he knocks on the door, and the young woman who was just moments ago joking with her friends that he hopes he's cute answers the door and says, "We're not open yet." And he holds up his McDonald's hat and says, "No, no, no, I work here now." And then there's a quick piece of her training him how to, take orders and give orders and deliver the food and stuff like that. And he looks at her and he says, no, he gets back home and they're walking up to the front door and his wife says, "How'd you do? How'd you do?" And he says, "I don't know how they could have ever gotten along without me." It's very funny, very cute, a masterpiece. The director is a gentleman named Lieberman. He now directs television series. It is a masterpiece of directing, writing, and you also have to realize very challenging to shoot because there's a lyrical song being sung during the whole commercial. Maybe you can find it. It's on my reel and blend it into, intercut it with the what we're talking here. There's a song being sung, and in between the song, there's dialogue being said on set. So the director had to engineer the dialogue to fit along with this whole complex story all in 60 seconds. So the commercial was intended to be run only one time on the Super Bowl. It was such a hit. This was during a time period when Super Bowl commercials were expensive. They still are to this day. But normally 60-second commercials weren't being run during normal broadcasts. But what McDonald's did, it was such a hit that over the course of the rest of the year, they would buy slots and run the commercial again because people loved it so much. So that's one of my favorites all time, only because it was fun to shoot, incredibly challenging to shoot, work with this phenomenal director, work with a great story, great actors, a perfect storm of how well it turned out. That's one of my all-time favorites.
Now, I have one last question that I like to ask everyone I interview.
Sure.
We're stuck in this pandemic and we're starting to go on to year 2 of it. And during that time, a lot of people have turned to streaming services for entertainment. Is there a show or a movie you've discovered that you think people should check out?
Well, I'm really enjoying Squid Game. Because it's so outside the box. I mean, it's true that many times some of the best things that are made end up not being US productions because people who make entertainment in foreign countries aren't driven by the same rules that we have here, that fund commercials and movies and television series here. There's almost certain criteria that they have to meet to get funded. Whereas overseas, none of those rules exist. And so it's so outside the box. It's like, whoa, and tremendous fun.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for letting me interview.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
And of course, I want to thank our sponsors, OWC. Go to owcdigital.com for all your filmmaking needs. I'm Gordon Raquel. Thanks for watching.